Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Stephen. Today I'm doing some more publishing myths. As promised, I went to a recent event, Fantasycon. This is an annual UK science fiction and fantasy convention we have every year. We haven't had one for the last couple of years, obviously because of recent events. So this was the first one I've been to in 2 years. So my voice is a little bit hoarse because I've been talking for 2 days non-stop mostly. Sat around with people going to panels. So one panel I went to was myths about publishing. So this is direct from various people. This is not me saying it. This is all information I got from the individuals. So who was on the panel? There was Marcus Gips. He's the publishing director of Gollancz. They're part of the Aryan group, which is part of the Hachette group. They publish people, Hachette publishes people like Joe Abercrombie, Stephen King, Ben Aronovich, John Grisham. So there's all of subdivisions, and then Gollancz is the science fiction and fantasy imprint. John Baker was on there. He's a new agent for about 4 or 5 years. He's from Bell, Lomax and Morton. He represents clients like Gabriella Houston, who writes Slavic folklore. Also, Esme Jacquini Pearson, apologies, I've mispronounced her name. She's the winner of the inaugural Gollancz and Rivers of London BAME SFF award. So she entered this award for her materials, sent it in, and she won. And now she's got an agent, and now she's going to be traditionally published. The third person on the panel was Dan Coxon. So he's a proofreader. He's also an editor of Unsung Stories, which is quite a small independent press in the UK that specialises in science fiction and fantasy, horror and also weird stories. And the fourth person on the panel, who's also a moderator, is Juliet Mushens. She's a literary agent. She represents people like Richard Osmond, who you may know from Pointless if you're in the UK and if it's overseas as well. His debut novel, The Thursday Murder Club, came out last year and has sold over 1 million copies. The second book in the series had just come out. Juliet also represents Jessie Burton, whose debut novel, The Miniaturist, went on to sell several million copies. It was translated into 24 languages, had a BBC drama about it. And also she represents Tara Matheru. He's a YA author, and his original series went on to sell over 1 million copies. So she deals with a lot of really big authors, and she also happens to be my literary agent as well. The first myth they spoke about was that the agent's job is done when they sign the contract and they simply just walk away and do nothing. All of them said that this just isn't true at all. They often act as the middleman between the publisher and the writer, the author. They have the awful conversations and the difficult ones that they don't really want to have with the author because they probably won't understand some of the reasons because it's from a business perspective. It's not personal. And trying to tell someone that your book can't come out for another year when they've signed or a couple of years or whatever it might be because of reasons that are complicated to do with the business and the publishing industry and what else is on the list and all this kind of stuff is quite awkward to have. There's conversations around contracts, there's conversations around other things. So one of their job is acting as a middleman. If the author gets edits that don't make any sense to them, they don't feel comfortable talking to the editor direct, they can act in that capacity. But equally they will work with the publisher on what are we doing for promotion, what's the plan for this book. So they don't just sign up for the contract and then walk away and do nothing at all. They're constantly talking to the publisher, finding out what's going on. They're the conduit. When you do get to smaller publishers, yes, you have a lot more direct interaction. But even this small indie press that I was speaking to, the editor there said, if possible, we encourage our authors to get an agent as well because it just seems to work a lot better. With a small publisher, you would be more directly involved anyway and have more hands-on, but working with an agent just brings sort of another level, and so they encouraged people also to get a literary agent, which was interesting to find out. The next myth that was being pushed around was that if a publisher just doesn't like your book, that's the reason they won't take it on, and that's why you've got rejected. So there's a lot more behind that. There's a lot of complicated reasons why a publisher might not take your book. One of the reasons they spoke about was to do with lists. Gollancz are a science fiction and fantasy publisher. They have a list of authors that they're publishing for the next 12 or 24 months. This will be existing clients and debut authors that are coming up. Let's say you've written a science fiction book about Mars and you sent it into Gollancz and they basically said, right, well, we're not going to accept your book. The reason for this might be in 6 months, 8 months, a year from when you've written to them, they've already got a science fiction book about Mars coming out. And if they put one out too close, it kind of divides the audience, it could split sales, and it's not good for anybody if you're trying to make an impact about this awesome book to do with Mars. What they could do is sort of hang on to it and wait for another couple of years, but that's no good for the agent, that's no good for the author, when someone else on another publisher, another list might say, oh, we haven't got anything like that on the list, we'd love to have it. So sometimes the no isn't because they don't like the book, is that right now it's not a good fit for them. And because it can take a year for books to come out traditionally published, is the kind of standard, is what everybody said on the panel, you can't really just hold on to a book for longer if you really like it. So as much as they might love a book, they sometimes have to say no to be fair to everybody else. The other thing they said is submissions are completely subjective. They're all down to the individual. And they all mentioned lots of famous authors who've been rejected many times, only to go on and be picked up by someone else and then sell lots and lots of copies. So just as your agent has to be a champion behind your book and love it, the editor has to love it as well. So you could get a no from one publisher, they take it to the next one, they say yes, and it goes on to do really, really well. It's not that that individual editor was wrong. It could be that they had something on the list like that. It could be that they just couldn't get behind it and didn't understand it. I remember an editor, as I said in my previous video about myths, they have to champion the book internally as well. They have to get behind it and love it as much as you. So you don't want someone who's just a bit, oh yeah, it's quite good, we'll take it on. You don't want that. So that's another reason they say no. Sometimes they just, it doesn't speak to them as an individual, and because they are an individual, they make decisions based on their gut as well as the business. The next myth was that the slush pile is where books go to die, and no one is ever picked up successfully from a slush pile. Everybody on the panel said that this just isn't true. Some agents get hundreds of missions a week, thousands a year. John was talking about he has something like 6,000 submissions a year. My agent Juliet, who's on the panel, has even more than that. And they all said, we read every single submission that's sent in through the slush pile. They will know, they also said, from reading the covering letter, first couple of paragraphs perhaps that talk about the book, the hook, what it's about, and John said he'd read that, then he'd jump to the book, and he'd know within the first couple of paragraphs if the book is ready or not. If he reads it and it's full of typos and it doesn't make sense and he can't get into it, then he knows it's just not ready. But he said very quickly he will know if he likes the book, if he's interested in it, then he'll go back and read the full covering letter and then he'll read the entire submission. So they can tell, because this is what they do every day, all day, within the first couple of lines, first couple of paragraphs, if they like the book, if it's interesting, if they want to read on. And that's what you want. Now, it doesn't say line 1, page 1, someone gets shot, or there's a murder, or some kind of bang that makes you instantly go, oh, now I have to read on. It's not about that kind of a hook. It was individual taste. Do I like the sound of this from the covering letter? Oh, that sounds quite good. And then they read it and go, oh, this is quite interesting. I really like that. And then they keep reading. And that's what you want. But they all said, almost all of their clients have come through the submission pile. Marcus, the editor of Gollancz, said in the past, Gollancz have had an open window where you could send submissions in, and other publishers do sometimes from time to time. Gollancz aren't doing it at the moment. So this is where an unagented author could approach a big publisher and send a submission in. Now, what they've said in the past, the last time they did one was 2019. Even then, if they like a book and they read it and think it was brilliant, they would then recommend a number of agents to that author and put them in touch, which is, a huge step forward to say, we really like this book, go and talk to this person with, our blessing and permission, and there's a good chance that agent will then take it on, because it goes back to what I said before, is they prefer to work with an agent than direct with an author for lots of reasons to do with the business side. It's one of these things to keep an eye out on. If you've got a book and it's ready, you can look for open submission windows up publishers, but equally they're all saying your best bet is still to approach an agent and try and get a deal that way with them, and they work on the book with you, and then they try and go to a publisher through channels where you have an agent already. So this next myth was quite interesting. The myth was that you have to have a large social media presence, you have to have lots of followers on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and whatever else, or you have to have been published before in order to get an agent. And everybody said this just isn't true. It's a myth for lots of different reasons. Credits can be useful. Say you've done 20 short stories and then you've written a novel and you approach an agent and they read a book. They said it can be handy, but equally everything they're focused on is that novel. If the novel's awful, it doesn't matter if you've self-published 100 books and have all done fairly well. They're not buying those books. They're not buying your back catalogue. And equally, they're not then going to be selling your back catalogue to a publisher. It's all about the book in front of them. It's all about that work. Equally, social media presence. The two agents on the panel, both of them said some of their clients don't like social media. They don't have any following, they don't have a presence because they're not comfortable with it. It's just not necessary. And some who do have large followings, they said it doesn't translate. So they're saying if you think of like Google adverts where you pay for certain phrases so that you get further up in the Google rankings, and then someone types whatever it might be, you appear. If you know anything about the business side of that, you know that the click-through rates are quite low. It's just how it works. It's just people see something, oh, that's quite interesting, but they don't always click on it. And it's the same with social media following. Saying you could have 100,000 Twitter followers, Instagram followers, but the percentage of people on those followers who will actually buy the book is just quite small. So it doesn't matter if you have 1 million YouTube followers, you're not going to get 1 million sales of your book. It just doesn't follow through. So having a large social media presence can be useful in terms of getting the word out after. Having a website, they said all this kind of stuff is useful as tools for communication. But if you don't have a website, you don't have any social media, when you approach an agent and then in turn a publisher, that's fine. They'll probably encourage you to build a website at bare minimum so that you have a place that when people Google your name, that pops up and there's all information about who you are and your books, and it's quite a good kind of resource. But you don't need to have a large following. It's just not true. And if anybody says that, they all said, well, there's something wrong because it doesn't translate. So if you approached a publisher, maybe a smaller publisher, who said to you, well, you must have a large following, otherwise we won't consider you, then there's something wrong, because they are also gambling on the thing that if you have 10,000 people, you're going to sell 10,000 books, which just isn't true. You might sell 500, or based upon those 10,000, who knows? It's just not true. It doesn't carry through. So don't worry about having that large a following on social media, or having previous writing credits is just not necessary. The next myth that they spoke about was publishing timescales. Now I touched on this a little bit in the previous video, but thought I'd revisit it again because I had some feedback from some people who didn't seem to believe me for some reason. So they all said, yes, the traditional publishing method is quite slow, it is quite old-fashioned, but the standard time frame is 1 year. So for when the manuscript is handed in to the publisher, they receive it from the agent, they read it, they like it, to when it comes out on the bookshelves in your bookshop, local store, it is about a year. Now that year has various things built in. As I spoke about before, publishers have lists, and they're obviously working on multiple books at the same time within the publishing house with different editors, and that period of time has extra time built in. So say one author is late on their book by a month, and another person, it was supposed to have their book coming out sooner, they can kind of move things and shuffle things around, or it gives them a bit of extra time that they give them 2 months but they only actually needed a month, and then they're delayed, or something terrible happens, or the printer who's printing the books breaks down and they lose a week there, or shipping with containers from overseas, or whatever it might be, all these problems. So they build in extra time, and as I said with the list, they might need to move things back and forward so that they know, right, we can get all of these books out within a 12-month period, but they've got extra time just in case. Problems with the editor, the publisher, the printer, the authors having issues, contracts might take longer than to negotiate, whatever it might be. They also said the American publishing model can be a bit longer as well. So if you sign a book and it goes to English worldwide rights, and it's published in England, America, Canada, all the rest of it, you might have to negotiate with another publisher overseas in America if they don't have a branch. So Gollancz has a UK branch and an American branch, but sometimes they do deals with other publishers. They might work with Orbit US. So Joe Abercrombie, his new book has just come out. In UK it's published by Gollancz. In America it's published by Orbit US. So there was a deal negotiated there, and for some reason they're saying books coming out in America take a bit longer. So if you're trying to arrange a release date for around the same time, that can be a bit difficult. So there's a bit of time extra time built in there to kind of negotiate it. With smaller press, the guy from Unsung Stories was saying that it can be less time to put out a book independently. However, if you're working with bookshops, it can be about a year as well. If you're just selling it online, an audiobook and through a website direct, it can be a lot less time. But if you want your book to go out into bookshops, you have to give them so many months notice up front so they can have it in their catalogues and tell people and do their own promotion. And it was still several months, and they said it can be about a year for us as well. The other thing we're going with small press is that the teams are much smaller. They don't have 20, 30 people working on the books. They might have 6 or 8. So all of them have to wear many different hats, and they're also working lots of books at the same time. So that slows the process down naturally because they don't have the time, the money, or the resources that some of the big boys do. So about a year is what they said for an independent book, but it can be a lot faster. The other thing they said is if you're working with franchised material, intellectual property owned by someone, whether it's a novel coming out, via Marvel or whatever it might be, that can take quite a bit of time as well because you have to get all of the changes and all the story ideas that you put in signed off by various people, because your story could affect how the character is perceived, which could affect his monetary value of that character, which affects a number of other things. So getting sign off for that is difficult and slow. So a year is a good time frame to do everything and get it all the way through the process from when it's signed to when it comes out on the shelf. The next myth was that you need to pay for a professional editor to work on your book before you should approach an agent. And everybody said, no, that's just not true. If you want to do it, that's fine, but you don't need to. What both agents on the panel said is that you should edit your book, do at least 3 drafts yourself, then approach someone that you trust, a friend, a colleague, whatever it might be, but someone who's going to give you useful feedback, not just, oh, I like that was really good, or that book was awful. You need someone to say, I didn't like the book for these reasons, or I did like this book for these reasons. But someone who can be a little bit critical, they said, is good, because it then gives you something to look at and say, is there any merit in what they've said? Do I need to work on this? Because when it goes to the agent, and then the editor, and then readers, they might say the same kind of thing. So it's something you need to be aware of, and also getting used to receiving constructive feedback on the book at an early stage is really, really good for further down the line. Most agents, the 2 on the panel, both said they will then work with the author on the book themselves before they take it forward to a publisher. Some agents don't, they have a very light touch, they might make some recommendations. Both agents said they'll read through the books, make notes, send that to the author, have a couple of conversations, talk about it. The author goes away and revises the book, and they do that as many times as necessary until they feel the book is ready. Then they'll approach the publisher and send it to some editors and say, what do you think of this book? Not all agents do that, but the 2 on the panel said that they do. The other thing they said, of course, is to try writing groups. That's another way to get good feedback from people because they're in the same boat as you. They want feedback. They want something useful that's going to help them improve the book. So that's another idea, whether it's a local writing group somewhere in your neighborhood or something online, something that's, quid pro quo, you actually get useful feedback. They all said you should try that too if you can. The last myth that they spoke about was that they publish people, not books. I guess this is around sort of personalities and this sort of stuff. And they said something really interesting, that in the past, readers were very loyal to a name author. They'd wait for the next book to come out and they'd just wait and read it and buy it sight unseen. But now, because the market has grown, let's say you've got author A who puts out a crime book, and every year they put one out. If they're late for whatever reason, and over here is author B that does something slightly similar, people will pick that up and buy it and read it. They might get back to the first one, but they might not. So there's less loyalty to the author. They're more interested in the story. Equally, they were saying that booksellers don't always know the name of the author. They know the title, they know the cover. Like someone say, oh, that blue book with the house on the front, there's some sort of crime thing they saw advertised on telly, or they saw it on a billboard or wherever it might be. So booksellers don't always know the name of the actual writer. So that was quite an interesting thing. Related to that was the idea that if you have something interesting about yourself, that can help sell the book, hence the whole kind of cult of an individual. And I said that's not true, but it can be a useful hook. So for example, the author might be an astrophysicist, so day-to-day, their day job is they work, it's all science-based, And that's quite an interesting thing they can use perhaps in the marketing. Perhaps when the book comes out and they want to do some sort of a unique event, they could have the author sit down with some other scientists and talk about the book. Maybe they could hold an event at an observatory. Maybe they could have other scientists analyse the book and think about where they would go. And that's just something a little bit different to do with the marketing, with the promotion of the book. But all of them said that's just a kind of a nice hook. Every person on the panel said everything comes down to the work. It doesn't matter how many social media followers you have. It doesn't matter how many other books you've written or something that you've done in the past. Content was key. The book has to be good, it has to be interesting, it has to be something that they really, really want. And here's the cat. So if it's not an interesting book, if it's not something that they really love, they won't buy it. It doesn't matter about any of that other stuff. So focus on the book, focus on making it really, really good. Approach an agent and try and get published that way through the slush pile, and just do your best. That's all of the myths I'm going to talk about from the panel, because that's all they covered. I'm not going to do another video this week because I'm quite hoarse and I'm quite busy with other stuff, but I will be back very soon. So thanks for all the comments as usual, and I'll be back soon.